Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dune Productions podcast, a podcast where we share filmmakers' worst nightmares. I'm Ethan.
I'm Jordan.
I'm Zach.
And every week we talk about the production of a film that, for one reason or another, ran into some problems, big problems. And Zach, this week you're going to be sharing a movie with us. Is that correct?
Yeah. This week, we are going over one of George Lucas's earlier movies called American Graffiti.
Wait a second. You telling me that he has a movie that's not called Star Wars?
Here's a few. Yeah.
Hold on.
Well, I think if I remember correctly, this is his second movie because this was after THX.
Mm-hmm.
No, his second movie was Empire Strikes Back. Okay, I'll end this bit. This bit is just trouble. We're going to lose subscribers by the second if Ethan keeps talking.
All right. So basically, the pitch for this movie is that it's kind of a loose fictional adaptation, sort of some of George Lucas's experiences as a kid in Southern California growing up.
Mm-hmm.
It takes place in 1962. And the main cast and crew included Richard Dreyfuss, Ron Howard, Harrison Ford, Cindy Williams, Candy Clark, Mackenzie Phillips, Wolfman Jack, Bo Hopkins, and Manuel Padilla Jr. And of course, it was directed by George Lucas. And he was also a writer on it, as well as Gloria Katz and Willard Hewick. There was another writer attached for a short period of time, but we will get to that later. And then the producer was Francis Ford Coppola, and the editors were Verna Fields and, of course, Marcia Lucas, who was involved heavily in his editing process whilst they were married. So, yeah, wow. That's kind of the main cast and crew.
Stacked.
Who is George Lucas?
George Lucas is a small indie filmmaker from the 70s and 80s. You might know him from projects like I don't know, Star Wars.
Wait, hold on.
He also made THX 1138 and this movie American Graffiti. And he's also the founder of Lucasfilm Limited, and which also is very much tied to ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, and other subsects of Lucasfilm, which have been a big portion or a big part of pushing the technical side of filmmaking forward, and making it what it is today. Like a lot of computer graphics, CGI, basically almost all CGI is thanks to him and his team working on that and really pushing the envelope back in the 70s and 80s. So,
and then he sold it all to a mouse.
Yeah.
That's neither here nor there. All right.
That's a different doomed production for another day.
So this is pre-Star Wars.
This is pre-Star Wars.
This was the movie he made before, like right before Star Wars. Is that correct? Yes.
So he actually was working on writing this. He was writing this at the same time that he was writing Star Wars. He hadn't. It's independent, so he didn't necessarily have it linked to a studio or anything yet. So it was still very much like an idea, and stuff like that. So this is after. So this is post THX. This is around the time when Warner Brothers is trying to develop Apocalypse Now. Lucas was attached for a short period of time, stuff like that, and of course they abandoned that and stuff like that. And then, he's writing this alongside Star Wars. So this one actually came about on the set of THX, because Coppola, who was also the producer on THX as well, was talking to Lucas and was like, hey, I'm going to challenge you to make a movie that very much appeals to, mainstream audiences, the kind of quadrant type idea of things, because THX was a little bit more niche. And he wanted it to be, or Coppola wanted to see George make something a little bit more accessible. So that's how this came about, was Lucas kind of sitting down with his experiences as a teenager and stuff like that, which is really fascinating to me, because as someone who has looked into George Lucas and his biographical material and stuff like that, he didn't want to be a filmmaker. He wanted to race cars and stuff like that, until he had a major accident and stuff like that. So cars are a big portion, or a big part of his movies, particularly American Graffiti and stuff like that. So seeing the influence of his early life and stuff like that on this movie particularly is really interesting, because you don't necessarily see movies nowadays that aren't biographical in nature that are like that heavily influenced by events in people's lives and stuff like that. But that being something that was important to him as part of the story, played a big part in the production of this film, and certain bumps in the road along the way. Yeah.
Well, it's funny that he's like, because I love THX, but like I get that it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I think it's pretty like like for me, and I think all of us at Dune Productions, it's a pretty accessible movie, I think, by our standards. Like it's not really out there. I mean, it kind of is, but I think it's funny that Coppola was like, listen, this is fine. This is cool. Make something more accessible that people can understand. Like that's kind of how I picture that conversation going. Like this is great and artsy, but it's not going to make money. Make something that'll make money. Like that's in. I mean, that's probably not what the tone was, but in my head, as you're telling that, that's how I imagine the tone is.
Yeah, that was an interesting thing that I found, because thinking about it from like a historical context of like what was like the general like expectation for movies at that time, and how THX would have been received by a theatrical audience and stuff like that in comparison to some other movies coming out at the same time. I don't know, I wasn't looking into THX, but it's just an interesting thought to think of, like how movies are received and thought of accessibility wise by audiences now versus then, because now a lot more people, like we have the internet and stuff like that, we know a lot more about the filmmaking process. Like general Joe Schmoes know more about it than they did back then, because normally that was just like, that nerdy kid running around with a camera type thing would know about that, but not much else type of a thing. So
Right.
Yeah.
So he gets that idea. Coppola says, make something that'll make money or it's more accessible. What does George do next?
So after the whole Warner Brothers kerfuffle with Apocalypse Now and stuff like that, THX comes out in 71, and he's offered a few opportunities to direct some other projects, but he turns them down because he wants to very much be focused on his own stuff, and he doesn't necessarily want to be like this puppet of other people type of a thing. He wants to work on his own things and things that he's passionate about. So this is when he came up with Star Wars, or an early version of Star Wars. And this is around the same time that he's also working on this project that would become American Graffiti. He eventually strikes up a deal to develop the screenplay for American Graffiti with United Artists, and they give him $10,000 to create it. He hires Joachim Katz, who I mentioned earlier, to write the screenplay, and they work on it for a while, but there is a deadline, and they ultimately can't complete it because they're working on their own film. So Lucas hires this other guy named Richard Walter. Now, this is a guy he knew from college. And so he was like, great, let's do it. It's going to be fun. We're going to be working together. It's going to be buddies. The only problem was Richard Walter had a very different idea of what the movie could be, because it was this very much like coming of age type idea. And he kind of ran with it a little too much. So he was like, hey, instead of it being on the West Coast, let's put it on the East Coast. Let's make it a little bit more sexual and kind of edgy and stuff like that. And Lucas was like, nah, let's not do that. I'm very much set on, like, I want it to be West Coast 1960s. I want it to be kind of very much based on like what my experiences were, because that's what I know. And so he ended up ultimately deciding, you know what, I'm going to keep going on my own way. And so Walter was paid the money that he got from United Artists, and now so he has no money now, and he's trying to expand his treatment that he initially created with the other two writers into a screenplay. And it's basically he's back at square zero with no money now.
So he hires the dude to help
Yeah.
him out, but is it because of contracts that he takes all of the 10 grand that was given to him?
Basically, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because the other two couldn't complete the screenplay because they were working on their own project. So they were like, you know what, we got to back out. So all they got was a treatment, or all Lucas got was a treatment from them. And then he was like, okay, I got to go with somebody else now. So he didn't end up paying them. He ended up paying Walter. And that's how he ended up with basically.
Did Walter write a draft of the script? Is that why he's...
Yeah,
he so he wrote the first
at
draft.
least parts of something anyways. Okay. But basically it didn't fit with what George Lucas was looking for. I wasn't able to find exactly how far they got
right
into the writing process of like, was there a first draft, was there a second draft, or was it just like pieces of stuff? But it was enough to warrant him getting paid, I guess. So
right.
Yeah. But at that time, he had apparently also pitched Star Wars to United Artists to fund that, and they had been one of the many studios that turned that down. So
yeah,
he was this is just kind of like in tandem timeline type situations. So he ended up actually trying to self-finance the screenplay for American Graffiti, since he wasn't getting money from the studios. So he also tried to pitch to other studios as well, such as MGM, Fox, Columbia, Paramount, and they all turned him down. And they also they eventually managed to write a second draft, and there was a whole kerfuffle in regards to the writers not necessarily being happy with what George wanted for the ending of the movie at the time when they had finished this particular draft. And they had this huge disagreement over different they wanted it to be more positive. They wanted it to include more women and stuff like that, because it primarily focused on the guys, and they were like, this is depressing, it's chauvinistic and stuff like that. And And George was like, not necessarily. He was like, that's it's kind of like the Big Lebowski thing. He was like, that's just your opinion.
Okay.
So it's a lot of these disagreements on where the story was supposed to go and what they wanted out of it, and George being like, this is what my idea is supposed to be, and it's ending up setting him back further and further and stuff like that.
Was George co-writing with these guys, or was he kind of
He
like
is so he is co-writing with them at this point. He wasn't on the first situation where Kurtz and Hewitt wrote the or Katz and Hewitt, sorry. Kurtz is a different guy. But he wasn't working with them at the beginning, but after he lost the money from United Artists, then he started working with them again when he was trying to fund it with other studios and stuff like that. But yeah. So
I find it interesting that George is someone who, it seems like in his early years, had a really hard time getting funding.
Yeah.
Like,
well, it's one of those things where it's like, this is a newer age in film. This is if you look at filmmaking in sections, you have like the classical Hollywood, and then you have this age where you're getting the film students that are going to film school and stuff like that, and learning from the people who are involved in classic Hollywood and stuff like that. So he's of this generation of filmmakers that's coming out of college, and it's like, well, what do we do exactly? Because there's these big production companies. Do you want to be part of the big production company, or do you want to make your own movie? And this is kind of a universal question throughout all things. And then of course you get to Tarantino and stuff like that, and the film festival groups and stuff like that. And then now that's kind of been less of a thing, and now we're on to the YouTube era.
We called it in film school, I think it was like New Age Hollywood, which is what we called it in like my film history classes. Was it was like, time's up, old man, the future is now. Like I mean, at the time, because there again, like you said, there was a bunch of kids right out of film school who like were all bumping elbows and were like, we're gonna make movies. And Hollywood was being bought by companies. It wasn't being like, all the old studio execs were retiring and selling their companies to like CEOs of like soap companies or whatever, right? Like, so it's like there's just these businessmen who don't know anything about like filmmaking necessarily, but they know business, and they're like, come work for us, kid, or whatever. You know, it's like, it's a very weird transitional period. It's fascinating but strange. So what happens with the next draft? How's the final draft of the film written? What happened?
Well, so it basically, they end up getting a projected budget from Universal, and they add on more once they get Coppola to sign on as producer. So that kind of gives them more faith in the project. And so after Lucas kind of takes more focus, after he kind of makes more of a first look deal with them, he continues to work on the script. And of course, the storyline is still very much being finalized, and people are still having problems with it. But they're ultimately like, you know what? We're going to write a third draft. We're going to make it work. And so they end up to they go into a third draft, and they end up getting through it without any interference from Universal, which is really nice, and you don't see that anymore today. But then there was a whole issue with, what are we going to call the movie? And so Universal was like, here's a list of titles, having looked over a script, and then Lucas was really not into any of the titles, and so he ends up persuading them to give it American Graffiti. And then they end up moving into production after their draft. So
isn't there a list of potential titles out there on the internet?
there
Right? I think I
is.
vaguely remember this. Like, what was one? It like wasn't it like the
there was like
class
Rock
of...
Around the Block or something. Yeah.
I was if I can find
Sounds
this.
like a musical.
Yeah.
Well, they were all like supposed to, because there's a bunch of teeny bopper movies that were made in the
Mhm.
50s. This was supposed to be like, it's kind of like if we made an 80s like kind of Stranger Things kind of like
Yeah.
throwback thing. I think isn't that what American Graffiti was supposed to be?
Yeah, it very much is a throwback to those older films. I mean, it is very much, it is set in the 60s, so that is very much, it's like in like actual time, it is in a way supposed to be based around that time, but it also stylistically, yes. Yeah.
Got it.
I found an article that has the list.
Oh, nice.
Hold on, where is it? Okay.
I have to plug in my computer. Let's pause for a second.
Read off the list while Zach does that.
Yeah. So the list,
You're
go
good,
ahead, Zach. The list was 1962 was some year. Then The Fast and the Deadly, which is not too different from The Fast and Furious.
Yeah.
The next one, The Cherry Coke Summer. Look Back Once. Pals and Gals.
I like that one.
Super Cola.
Super Cola.
Buddies. The Toy Dream's Gone. Or Makeout.
Some of these are interesting. Some of these are weird.
They don't fit the movie, I don't think, necessarily.
Some of them are kind of cool as standalones, but
look, I mean, out of all these, the best one, the one that sticks out the most to me is like either Makeout or The Cherry Coke Summer. Because while they might not fit the movie, I'm like, that makes me wonder, like, about something. I mean, Makeout sounds pretty straightforward, but it's also like, it's not too different from like Blowout or like other, like just a, 2-word title.
Yeah.
But Cherry Coke Summer has got a nice
it sounds like a top 10 summer song kind of thing. Like
that's Watermelon Sugar you're thinking of.
Yeah, same thing.
Yeah, no, those titles are pretty crazy or interesting, I should say. They're not like wild. Like none of them are like,
what the heck were they thinking?
Yeah, none of them are like exploitation kind of titles or anything. Like you could see what kind of movie they were thinking of selling this as.
1962 was some year or whatever that first one was. It's weird.
Kind of a mouthful. Yeah,
that one's a bit much.
Yeah.
Did you find why they settled on American Graffiti?
I didn't. I knew at one point because I did like a whole project in high school on, or was it middle school? I did a project at some point on George Lucas, and like I knew like the whole backstory on like why he chose American Graffiti as the title, but I don't remember. It's just a bummer.
So they have the title, they have the script.
Yes. So now they move on to the casting. So this is when they start reaching out to the Bay Area, and they're looking at high schools and stuff like that. And this is actually when they discover Mark Hamill. And he's like, let's put a pin in that. We'll get to you later. And so they're very much looking into a bunch of unknown actors for Kurt Henderson, one of the lead roles. And they eventually end up getting in. They get Richard Dreyfuss, and Lucas is very much like, oh, hey, this guy is actually like taking this seriously and stuff like that. And so he actually gives him a choice between a couple of the different characters, so Kurt or Terry. And so he ends up also finding Ron Howard. And so this is his breakout role as a child actor initially, before he goes on to become a director that we all know and stuff like that.
Who went on to work on a Star Wars property for a time.
And now his daughter is directing Star Wars stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's crazy.
Well, they're like friends. Like now they are. Like right?
Mhm.
Like in the 70s and 80s, Lucas and Ron Howard, they're like buddies.
Yeah.
Pretty
Yeah.
sure. Like I think
Oh, yeah.
didn't Bryce Dallas Howard, didn't she talk like George Lucas was kind of like an uncle to her or something like that?
She had said something like that in like the whole roundtable thing that they did for the first season of Mando or something.
Like doesn't she talk about like she like went to dinner with her dad and George Lucas, and also
Yeah,
like there was like
something
a
like
Kira Kurosawa there or something? There's some crazy
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
some
That sounds familiar.
yeah, and she's like this little 4-year-old who's like listening to these masters, and she just, you know, she's 4 years old. She's just, you know, she's in her
Imagine
own
just
world.
growing up like that. Just
Yeah.
like, here's George Lucas, Ron Howard is your dad, and you're with Akira Kurosawa, the dude who inspired Lucas to make
Yeah.
Star Wars.
I
And you're
didn't
4 and you don't care.
Yeah.
well, I mean, it's surprising that she's into film at all. You know what I mean? Like, because
Yeah.
if my dad or mom talked to me that much about work, and that was like, I'm
Mhm.
not sure if I'd care that much. Like, my dad has worked for like Intel before. If he was like, I don't know, talking like if his whole life was Intel, I'd probably grow up being like, Intel. You know, it's all
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So it's like the
Microchips. Lame.
well, that's like how kids, you know, like if you try to force your kid to like a certain movie, of course they're not going to like it.
Right.
Yeah.
It feels more like less likely that they will like it. I don't know. You can't
Yeah.
force that stuff. So it's cool that she's into Star Wars and she's making cool Star Wars episodes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She does a good job.
Anyways, yeah. Who else did they cast in the movie?
They went with a bunch of other at that time unknown actors. They did pull Harrison Ford in, who was actually at that time a carpenter. So
Really?
this was before he was doing this is like before his big boom as an actor. But it was interesting. He took the role on the condition that he wouldn't have to cut his hair. So he ends up wearing a
A
Stetson.
cowboy hat, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's
funny.
the reason behind the cowboy hat in the movie, is that he did not want to cut his hair.
Sounds like a Harrison Ford thing to say.
Yeah.
Harrison Ford. Move on.
Explains it.
Move
Okay.
on.
Who anyone else cast of noteworthy?
Coppola was talking with Lucas during the casting situation, as a producer does. And he was trying to get him to get Wolfman Jack in a cameo appearance, because that was when he was big back then. And so there's a quote that Wolfman Jack talks about, and he says, George Lucas and I went through thousands of Wolfman Jack phone calls, and they were taped with the public. The telephone calls heard on the broadcasts, in the motion picture, and on the soundtrack were actual calls with real people. So yeah, that's
Great.
Yeah.
So he
I
just
thought it
was
was
like,
cool.
we're gonna record these
Yeah.
interviews with you, and you're just gonna like just let us use your voice pretty much.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Almost
Wait-
kind of like what they did with No, that's different. Never mind. I'm not gonna follow that thought. Sorry, I thought I had a comparison, but I didn't.
When do the troubles start?
Well, the first thing that happened in actual production was they had started filming in San Rafael, and they had this deal with them, and it was almost immediately revoked because one of the key members of production was growing marijuana back then, and that was like that was a big no-no. So they basically had to scrap that whole location. They were like 1 or 2 days into filming, and they were like, okay, we got to move. So they end up going to Petaluma, which is kind of close by, but they have to move to a completely different city. And in the meantime, he convinces San Rafael City Council to let them do a couple more nights of filming, just so that he has some sort of continuity location wise. And so all this going on. Where was I in my notes? I lost where I was.
What about like I wonder who was growing the weed.
I
Was it
looked
Mr.
into
Lucas himself?
Smoking those death
I
sticks.
tried looking into it. I didn't take a lot of time to look into it just because it's only one of the aspects, but I couldn't find it. But I'm sure if you do enough digging, you can find it somewhere.
It was child Ron Howard.
Child Ron Howard. Oh my gosh.
Rebel.
Watch it. It was Harrison Ford.
I believe it.
Yeah. So they move cities. They get some pickup shots.
Mm-hmm.
What next?
And then things continue to go relatively smoothly until one of their other actors, Paul DeMatt, is sent to the hospital because they had walnuts on sets. And he had, he had an allergic reaction.
Got it.
Wait, did he eat them, or did he like walk on a set and like sniff the air and then fell into like a coma?
It was just one of those things where it's like, here's a detailing of the production, and it's like Paul DeMatt was sent to the hospital because there was walnuts on set.
He just really hated walnuts.
I picture that scene from Invasion of the Body Snatchers where he like walks on set and then he's just like,
Yeah.
and then he like falls over and they're like, oh
Yeah.
shoot, who brought the walnuts on set?
Oh man,
This
And it was
happens all the
child
time,
Ron
guys.
Howard.
it's just all Ron Howard's fault.
Yeah.
Oops, all Ron Howard.
Oh my gosh. Oh yeah, and so then at one point during production, George Lucas's motel room is also set fire by one of his actors.
On purpose?
Was it because of the walnut
Was it
situation?
child Ron Howard? What was Ron Howard on these days?
Oh
like he was
God. Marijuana.
He was smoking. He was bringing walnuts on set. He was setting fire to the director's room. This guy was a menace.
And then later, the same guy who had the reaction to the walnuts, Lamat, ends up throwing Richard Dreyfuss into a swimming pool, and he injures his face the day before he's supposed to get his close-ups done. So now he has this huge gash in his forehead, and on top of that, he's been complaining about the wardrobe for his character, and so he has to, of course, get that figured out, and so they delay the close-ups and stuff until he's in a situation where it looks somewhat passable.
That's annoying. I just did some quick math really quick. You know how old Ron Howard actually was on this set? He wasn't a child.
How old was he?
He was 19.
Oh.
Newly adult Ron Howard?
A felon. The felon Ron Howard.
Felon Ron Howard.
I remember because he's not a kid. He's like a teenager kind of.
Right, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I don't hate Ron. This is not me.
No, we're memeing.
Yeah.
And then another motel incident. Harrison Ford is kicked out of his Holiday Inn. I did not find out why.
Ron Howard.
I'll tell you why.
Oh. And then so another whole throwing it back a couple podcasts to some action on wheels per se, not a chariot race, but climactic
You telling me
car
100
race
horses
scene.
died in this movie?
No, 2 camera operators actually were almost killed in the whole race scene sequence. So that
Child,
almost happened.
did Child Ron
Child
Howard
Ron
like cut the brakes? Wild card. Okay, we'll end this meme.
Oh man.
It's done its time.
All right. Anyways, that was basically it for the production troubles per se. Editing goes relatively smoothly. And of course, this is Marsha Lucas and Verna Fields, who had actually been working with Steven Spielberg before this one. For editing, Universal brought on Verna Fields, in addition to Lucas bringing on his wife, Marsha Lucas, to edit the film, which was initially around 3.5 hours long, and the
Three and a half
studio wanted to
hours?
3.5 hours, yeah, the rough
Oh,
cut,
wow.
yeah. And so, of course, the studio wanted it down to 2 hours, and so they had to cut and combined a lot of scenes. And during all this cutting, the way that the script was written, it had this ABCD story structure with each of the main characters of Steve, Kurt, John, and Terry the Toad. And so it was kind of like he had envisioned presenting them all as one sequence. But
Like individual, like short films.
yeah.
Okay.
But that was becoming difficult in the editing process, so we ultimately ended up with the version that we have now. So the structure was a lot looser than initially expected by George. And so it ended up running just under 2 hours, and was released. Or no, that wasn't the release date. That was where it was at at the end of 1972.
Nice.
And so they still had to do audio mixing and stuff like
back.
that. And so basically the way that they tied it through, or the through line, was Wolfman Jack as being this kind of overarching presence for the kids.
Well, the
instead
structure,
of it following
the structure feels very I feel like, I don't know, this might be incorrect. From my memory of watching movies from that time, obviously the 60s and 50s, even, like, movies were paced very differently. And I think that had Lucas stuck with the present one character story and then jump back and do the next person's stories, that's a cool idea. And I'd actually love to see a re-edit of the movie presenting the stuff like that.
Be cool,
that would be interesting. But I think I can kind of see, I could imagine that version of the cut would drag, and I would imagine that it would feel a little bit slow.
Yeah.
And so I think the cross-cutting between the different storylines and Wolfman Jack's presence, like that narration of just like, you need a transitional period, just throw a narration over there.
Yeah.
And then it cuts to, like, for me, that feels more contemporary, and it feels makes it feel a little more timeless in a way.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I've seen the movie, but from my memory, I would imagine like that was a good call on the editing.
Yeah. Especially if he's still going for the accessibility that Coppola was talking about earlier.
Right.
Yeah. So, it ultimately ended up getting unanimous praise at test screenings, and was attended by Universal executive Ned Tannen, who had been kind of helping along this particular project in certain aspects, like the editor and stuff like that. And so where was I? Sorry, my notes are really not necessarily in order on this. Right. Yes. So, basically he gets offers from a couple different studios, for buying the film. And so he gets offers from Paramount and Fox. And Universal basically refuses these offers, and tells George that they're going to basically re-edit the film. So that was kind of a point of contention, you could say. And so after, of course, The Godfather comes out in early 73, Universal ends up agreeing to go with Lucas's cut of the film instead, because they're like, hey, maybe these guys know what they're doing. So they thought that initially it was going to be fit to be released as like to air on television, as opposed to being a theater release. But they ended up getting a bunch of the employees to start talking it up, and so its reputation kind of was preceding it by word of mouth, and they instead ended up deciding to move towards more of a limited release for theaters in LA and New York. And then it ultimately ended up getting released in August of 73 to what they call a sleeper hit audience reception. And so the film only costs like $1.33 million, and it ended up grossing more than 55.
Not
so
bad.
It was considered really a success at that time. Yeah. So I'd run some numbers, and that's like 340 million. 55 is 340, roughly.
And it would have cost about $6 million, if I do this calculation correct.
Something like that, yeah.
They don't make $6 million movies these days anymore.
No.
Well, like if you're like Wes Anderson or something, like, or I guess he's probably more like 20 or 30, but like, yeah, they don't make $6 million movies much anymore.
Yeah.
Lame.
Dude, if we had $6 million, you know how many movies we'd make? We'd be unstoppable.
6 million.
We'd make 6 million movies. But yeah, it's a blessing how cheap filmmaking has become since the 60s or since the 70s.
Yeah.
Well, that's cool.
But yeah, so it did end up getting very good reception. So of course the troubles and the stress of the film were not super indicative of its quality or its result. So that's, at least from an audience standpoint, that's good.
That's good.
So. Have you guys both seen American Graffiti too?
It has been a while, but yes.
No.
We are having a movie night.
I know.
I do need to see it again. Reading up on this has made me want to rewatch it.
I just George Lucas as a director doesn't interest. I'm not even gonna
You
try.
can't even finish that sentence.
It's
You can't
literally.
even...
I got
Man is
Harrison
speaking
Ford and
I
Star
know.
Wars
I got.
heresy.
right here. I can't
got all
even
my-
like.
I got my Star Wars shelf right. Well, it's that
Yeah,
right there. All my Star Wars books and
You
everything.
mind saying that again?
yeah. I know. I'm sorry. I take it back.
Yeah.
It was a lie.
It's a fun movie. It's like a fun like slice of life hangout. Like it's one night, right? It takes place over just one
Yeah.
night. Bunch of friends hanging out. Like it's a fun movie. It's
That's cool.
it's
I like
good.
that.
I think you'd like it.
It reminds me of a certain film we made that took place during one night
Let's not
many
talk
years
about
ago.
that. Let's not talk about that one.
A sleepover, perhaps.
No.
That was also American.
Yeah, it's got a American
Anyways,
title.
I digress.
That's cool.
All right.
Yeah.
So that is American Graffiti. Yeah. We
More
wanna
like
move on to
American
the-
filmmaking nightmare.
You know,
Nah.
it's funny because all of those troubles would have been those are monumental for a low budget. It feels
Mhm.
dirty to say low budget for a movie that had $1 million,
Yeah.
but in
Yeah.
Hollywood standards and back
Mhm.
then, relatively low budget, I guess.
Yeah.
Average budget, maybe. I don't know. Having
Mhm.
those setbacks and those problems, that probably would have felt monumental way back then. But it's
Mhm.
Yeah.
it's kind of funny, like we talk about like horses dying and like Marlon Brando on set and all these other things. And that seems crazy. By comparison, this doesn't feel as crazy. But like if I actually put myself in George Lucas's shoes and be
Mhm.
like, we're shooting for 2 days, we're having an awesome time, and then all of a sudden the cops are like, hey, you guys got to leave town because someone's wearing pot in where somewhere it doesn't specify
Yeah.
where. It just says they were growing. It's like, what? No, we're losing our, like all this, and then the actor's face gets messed up for the close-up in the hotel. Like,
Mhm.
gosh, I'd be depressed by the end of that shoot. Like that sounds
Yeah.
like if I really put myself in those shoes, I would. That sounds like hell.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, especially when it's like this movie that's based around your experiences as a teen. It's like so much of you is in this film.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's like, man, I'd be panicking.
Yeah, it's
Personal. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot on the line there. And early on in your career, this is like your first
Yeah.
big like money maker that you're trying
Yeah.
to make,
Mhm.
trying to like prove yourself as like a commercial filmmaker. That's
Yeah.
like, yeah, that's big. That's a career ender if you throw that.
Mhm.
You don't pull it off.
So what's the
I mean,
lesson?
Yeah.
Don't do drugs, kid. No. No. Let's see. I guess. I mean, you're always going to have problems on a film set, not necessarily to this extent or worse. But problems always arise, no matter what you're doing. And it seems like what we can learn from George Lucas is having a cool head and staying the course. And it seemed like he had a very clear vision for what he wanted, and he did what he could to preserve that as much as possible, even if it meant facing some creative setbacks.
Mhm.
But it ultimately worked out. So I guess this could be maybe seen as like an example for inspiration for people that may be facing some troubles of like, hey, my movie, I've been working on this for some time. I've poured a lot into this, and now I'm facing some troubles. Of course, if you need to make some compromises creatively or whatnot to make it happen, that is ultimately up to you. But it sounds like he really stuck the course on this one and was like, here, we're going to do everything that we can to get this version of the movie out. Yeah.
I feel like in the future, not to say too much, but you'll have more to speak on with those themes, Zach.
Yeah, no, it was
Not to be on the nose.
We will get to that when that movie is released.
In due time.
I have another counterintuitive lesson we can learn from this, I think. From this story, but also if you look into George Lucas's like early film days, you get the gist, you get the idea that he's very into experimental movies, like nonlinear storytelling, movies that are more concerned with the idea of form and filmmaking and editing rather than narrative. Again, THX, we don't consider that. That's not necessarily avant-garde or anything. It's a little more out there, but it's like you can tell George Lucas's sensibilities back in those days were much more like experimental, kind of. And so Coppola says, try to make something more accessible. And now we think of George Lucas as this kind of storytelling, filmmaking pioneer, innovator, great at myth, crafting American myth, really. So, every now and then, I mean, I know we all have our our leanings to what kind of movies we prefer to make, but every now and then it's okay if you think about the like what will connect with a lot of people. You don't always have to do only what you want. Sometimes great ideas or great careers can be formed if you think for one project, hey, like I'll make something for the audience instead of purely for myself necessarily.
Or finding where that meets,
right?
Because a lot of this is, like I keep saying, from George Lucas's previous experience. So finding a way that's like, how do I make, okay, if I want something that's going to appeal to a wide audience, what's an idea that I feel passionate about that I can form into something like that, or I don't know, vice versa.
Yeah. Well, with that, should we move into our next segment?
Let's do it.
Our next segment is where it's kind of like our Doomed Productions movie club, where we come together every week. We choose a movie to watch on our own, and then we come together and talk about it. And this week was Ethan's pick.
Yeah.
What was your pick, Ethan?
I picked Possessor, the 2020 film by one of the Cronenbergs. I forget which one.
David Cronenberg, his son, or Brandon?
Brandon Cronenberg. David Cronenberg's son, yeah.
His son, yeah.
Yes.
We'll check that.
Thank you for remembering for me. But yeah, it is a kind of science fiction thriller movie. It sounds like it would be a demon possession movie. It is not, but it's pretty wild. Jordan, do you want to talk about it first?
Yeah, it's a movie that eludes my understanding as of now.
Well played.
I was bad, and I did not get a chance to watch the movie.
It's all good.
So
it's
on my list. It's still there, and I will be watching it soon.
Good. It's a good movie. I really enjoyed it. It was recommended to me by a Sam Beamish, a filmmaker on YouTube who is very talented and worth checking out his work. But he recommended it to me on a Zoom call, a couple months ago, and it's been on my list. So we finally got around to watching it. So yeah, Zach, do you want to share a little bit about your thoughts on the movie?
Yeah. When you gave me the title, I had never heard of this movie. I, like you, thought it going in, I was like, oh, this is going to be kind of like exorcism type situation with like demons or something, who knows. But it ended up being like this kind of like hitman thriller type situation.
It feels a little Black Mirror-esque.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. And like I remember talking to you after we watched the movie, and I think we kind of agreed on that it kind of has elements of Nolan in it, kind of.
Yeah.
I mean, it very much is its own thing, but I guess that's the closest thing I would compare it to would be, it feels kind of like a Nolan movie.
Yeah.
But like,
Heavier.
yeah, it's almost like if Nolan did the Joker, but
Yeah, I
if
see
it
that.
was like a sci-fi thrill.
Yeah. I know it gets out there real quick.
Yeah.
No, I agree. It's there's a lot. It was a lot more in like the psychological side of body horror. There's like literal body horror in it, but I think there's also a lot of like the mental aspect of like trying to like watch someone be someone else, literally try and like fill the shoes of another person's body, and act as that person. I don't want to say too much, but that's the general premise. Is it's a hitman who takes over people's bodies to carry out hits. And
That's an awesome premise.
Yeah, it's sick. But like it really goes into like her, like how degrading it is on her, on the main character. I don't want to say too much beyond that, but I think they handled the stuff really well, and just like what makes a person, and then also just like, you know, the impact of someone who does this work. And the literal like the demons that come with it, I guess. So there is some demon stuff in it, but yeah.
There reminds me of, there's a story that I haven't read but I heard about where similar to this, where it's like about a person who every time he goes to sleep he wakes up as in a different body.
I've heard of this one.
Oh,
yeah.
I can't remember who wrote it. I don't know what it's about, or I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know like the author or anything, or like, but it seems like it would ask those similar questions of what is a person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's good. I like the movie a lot. Jordan, I look forward to having you see it and hearing your thoughts.
Yes.
Yeah. And not to jump the train too much here, but last week you brought up some stuff in your podcast about Jodorowsky's Dune that you wanted to carry on the conversation.
Well, yes. I forgot.
I will be listening. I have to run to the oven because I have food in there, but I'm listening. So I'll be back with my thoughts if you guys want to carry on the conversation.
It's not Chipotle. You don't have Chipotle?
No, I got potatoes and green beans cooking.
Well, what Ethan's talking about is last week, or not last week, I guess a few weeks ago, because it's been a while. I did a solo episode where I talked about the making of Jodorowsky's Dune, his attempt to make that movie, adapt that book. And it's fascinating story full of different stuff. And there's a documentary made about it a few years ago. Well, gosh, it's almost 10 years ago now, because that was 2013. Oh my gosh, that was 10 years ago. Lord. Oh, sorry, I'm having an existential crisis right now. We saw this documentary together, and so we kind of have this, it was very formulative, like this story of this fiction, or of this what could have been movie, almost made movie. And so it's just been a part of our vocabulary as we've been talking about movies for a long time. Zach, have you heard about this attempt to make Dune?
I have heard about it. The documentary is on my list of things that I need to watch. I have yet to get around to it.
It's it's a really compelling documentary. I think you'd love it. I think most.
So you've told me.
Like
I'm excited to get to it. Especially after seeing Denis Villeneuve's take on the story.
Yeah. But last week, because it was a solo episode, I kind of was like, I don't know if the guys want to chime in on anything that they either heard about this movie, or they listened to the podcast and they had questions, or I don't know. So, Zach, did you listen to the podcast?
I have not finished it. No,
you're killing me. No, I'm joking.
Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. Well, to give you the gist, it was insane. But here's the gist of the documentary, the making of the movie is or the making behind Jodorowsky's Dune, the story behind it is it was a project filled with lots of wild, crazy, what could have been, like you had Mick Jagger from the Rolling Stones in the movie, you had Salvador Dali, you had Orson Welles, you had all these unique and wildly creative decisions that were going to be made for this movie at a time where it would have predated lots of other science fiction stuff. So by the end of the movie, you get the sense that had this movie come out, popular cinema today would have looked much different than it does now, probably. And it because it would have predated a lot of stuff.
Right.
And it would have been a wild, crazy project. So Ethan, do you have any thoughts or questions that you had about the thing? Or you and me have a similar history with our knowledge of the story.
Yeah, it's crazy that it was 10 years ago, like you were just saying. It made me want to go back and rewatch it and also dive back into Jodorowsky's filmography. I've seen a few of his films. It makes me like, this feels like such a strange choice for him to make Dune. And I feel like I have never read Dune. So I can't speak to you have, Jordan. So maybe I'm about to say something that's totally wrong. It feels like he would have made a Dune that's very different in a lot of ways from the books in terms of like tone and feeling. But maybe I'm wrong.
Okay. If I had just read the first Dune book, because I'm on the fourth one right now. If I had just read the first one, I probably would have slightly agreed with you more. But I think having read 4 of the books and kind of get a better understanding of this world and what's going on and the kind of philosophical, internal, kind of mental side of everything.
Yeah.
I think he's also a great choice and he would have done different things and made the movie his own. But I think he would have brought forth a more strange side of Dune that was in the books, but I find is slightly absent as of now in Denis Villeneuve's version of the. I mean, okay, this is slight spoilers. I'm not going to be specific, but for the third Dune book and fourth book, if they ever make those movies, there's a character who wants to become a worm, and
I've heard of this.
In the fourth book, he becomes a worm. Not metaphorically, literally. He literally turns into a worm. He starts changing into a worm.
Incredible.
That is something that sounds very right at home with Jodorowsky.
I take back what I've said.
So that's right. If you kind of don't think about that kind of more fantastical, weird science magic kind of side of Dune, if you just read the first book. But if you kind of read more, you're like, oh my goodness, these books are really weird. What's going on?
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry to hijack your point.
No, you're fine. And I don't know where I was going entirely anyways, or I don't remember at least, but all that to say, like, it feels like such a strange combo, but it's like, I am perplexed and so captivated by it. Yeah. And it's years later, I still am like, when are we going to get like a full scan of the storyboard book that has everything in it and to get to like read and visualize Jodorowsky's Dune and what would have been?
Yeah.
Well, they have concept art out there, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Because I've seen some of that.
There's a storyboard book though that's just the whole thing, like every panel, every frame as like a comic. So you can get a rough idea of what Dune would have been like.
That's cool.
And I'm very curious. And the casting choices are just super cool. Yeah. No, it's just an otherworldly film in all the ways. And I wish it could have existed, but I'm glad we got at least some of it.
Yeah.
And Jodorowsky's still just a cool director.
Yeah. He's one of my favorites. But it's I'd highly recommend watching that documentary to anybody. It gives you like everything you need to know. It tells it in a really compelling way. And it's you can dive deeper into the Jodorowsky rabbit hole afterwards. Yeah.
Always a good time.
Yeah. Should we move on to our next segment?
I say so. Yeah.
So our next segment to new listeners is, what are you working on? Because here at Dune Productions, we primarily make feature films and short films and all that. not just videos about filmmaking and podcasts, but we are filmmakers ourselves, and we're working on stuff. So, guys, what's been new?
I haven't been working on film stuff as much, like scripts and writing. I've kind of gotten a little sidetracked. I have a new YouTube channel. And so that's kind of been like where my balance has been now, is making videos for that. And then this, and then also finishing up a short film that we're going to have out here pretty soon.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, those are the 3 plates. So until that short film gets out, at least feature films have been on a slight hiatus for me.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, if you
will the public know about this short film by the time this podcast comes out?
No.
Oh,
should we give a date?
I'm nervous too.
I'm hesitant because as soon as
yeah, that's
knowing
the
us
thing about the date, though.
No, we're not going to give a date.
We're not going to do it. No.
The short film coming out sometime soon.
Yeah,
very soon. I should say very soon. Yeah.
If you saw The Bell Rings and Two Little Ghosts in Yakima, you might have a bit of a better idea of what the short film will be.
There we go.
Oh, yeah.
There we go. That's perfect.
Everyone else, we'll find out.
Yeah.
But yeah. If you like film photography, though, I have a YouTube channel. It's linked in our channels thing here on Dune Productions. It's channel's called Ethan, but it's film photography and photography channel. So yeah, if you like photography, go check it out.
Yeah,
that's all. That's what I've been working on.
Zach, what have you been working on?
I've been doing homework.
Nice.
Film homework, though, right?
Well, yes, I have been doing film homework. I have been working on 2 stories currently. I haven't been like very like hard into one specifically right now. But I've been kind of developing both as I get inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
One of those being Strange Case. So that's that, I guess. I have also been doing some rewrites and been working on some logistics for Coalescence, which has not been worked on in some time. But my hope, I have not reached out to actors yet. But for those listening that are actors in that movie, I will reach out to you soon. But I have been working on the best course of action on how to finish that film, given some of the struggles it's had behind the scenes and stuff like that. So, yeah, just fun logistics stuff.
That's the best part of filmmaking, is the logistics.
Oh yes,
everyone's favorite.
Yeah.
Never a dull moment.
But yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, this project has been very stressful for me, and you all will hear about the specifics later after the movies come out when we do behind the scenes stuff. But I'm at the point in this project where it's exciting because I'm finding solutions to certain problems that I've run into, and I can see the end coming where I previously couldn't. So I'm like, I can see this getting done now. So it's been a very big learning experience for me as a filmmaker. It definitely, while Wild Boys was my first feature film, this one feels more like I expected my first feature film to feel like, in regards to like working out all the kinks and struggles and stuff like that.
In regards to pain, this is about it.
No.
So we'll see what happens with that. But currently, it's looking better than it has. So
nice.
Yeah,
it's good.
It's exciting.
That's it for me. How about you, Jordan?
We are going to shoot a movie this summer up in Yakima. We're going to do some shooting for I guess a musical sequence that's going to be in the movie. We're going to shoot that this Thursday. It's going to be fun. Should be pretty relaxed, and we're just kind of chipping away at pre-production, slightly ramping up into production a little bit, but mostly pre-production right now. So there's been that. And then the other thing is I've kind of been working a lot more on animation stuff. So I also have a YouTube page. You can't like, it's not like dedicated to animation, but you can see animation stuff on there that I've done, or like my Instagrams. You can find that stuff. Like if you just click around, I'm not gonna, you can find that stuff. So I've been working on a lot of animations, just a lot of drawing right now, just kind of getting ready to do more animated projects and films and everything. So yeah, that's been my world for the last little bit.
Yeah. We're working hard.
Yeah.
Ruin.
That is everything for this episode. Thank you to all the viewers who have listened this far. If you like this video, check out our other podcasts. We got a lot of them, and we'd love for you to click around, find stuff you like, leave us comments down below and all that good stuff. But yeah, hope everyone has an excellent week. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you later.